This is an introduction to Gearbox version 2. It's a new release of my asset library, and I'll be going through installation and a quick overview of what's in the assets. And so let's get started. Notice I'm on 4.3.2 that just got released recently, and the toolkit does require 4.0 something. I use matrices, I use integer math, a couple other things that are necessary for this toolkit. So let's get started. First thing, when you're installing assets, check your preferences. The default file path for user libraries, for asset libraries, is under your home folder, Blender/assets. I changed that. You don't have to do that. But what you have to make sure is make sure that this folder exists. Also set import method to append for this. Once that's set up, and notice that we don't have this, these brushes here, normals, these are all available in the default Blender when you get 4.3. Okay, let's quit out of here. I've opened a couple of terminal windows. I'm using Linux. Of course, this will work on Windows or anything as long as it's Blender 4.3. Right now, there's nothing in assets. In downloads, this is where I download stuff off the net. From my Chrome browser, this is my default place. And I've downloaded Gearbox version 2. I'm going to recommend that you create a temp folder and unzip the Gearbox asset library there. And you'll get this cats.txt file, the Blender asset cats, and a bundle. The bundles are a new thing in the latest assets. I'm really not sure how long they've been available, but the way you install from a bundle is by opening up. And this, so this is the bundle you'll get from the zip file. I've got a short blurb. I've got the documentation on Read the Docs. And I've opened this up to the asset browser. And this should come up as a default. Should be set to current file. If it's not, make sure it's set to that. It's got all the assets here, including the new bevel gear and a couple things I'll go over in the overview. And all you need to do to install is copy bundle to asset library, specify the user library, and that's that location that you made sure was real, and Gearbox bundle. And that gets copied directly to your asset file. We can now clear out of this. And if you look in your assets, it's all set up. And you're ready to go. So let's, and you don't have to keep this temp file around. Just clean up after yourself. It's always nice. And let's bring up Blender again. For an overview, I'm going to walk you through all the gears, including the new gear rack, the bevel gear set, of course. We're not going to cover the gear shift and motor. These are used when you are animating a set of gears. So we're not going to be doing that here in the overview. I'll get into that in future videos. For the bevel gear set, which is the new gear, anybody who's used the toolkit before has played with spur and helical gears, and I'll also get into those, but in general. But let's just take a look real quick at the bevel gear set. By default, these are meshed together properly, and they stay meshed even if you change the gear ratio. And like with all gears, the size of the gear is determined by the module, which is the size of the gear tooth. Basically, the height is 2 modules from gear to gear. Along the pitch radius is 2 modules. But what we're going to do is not go into too many details about gears themselves. I'll try to do that in future videos. In fact, I'm not going to talk about pressure angles when I'm talking about bevel gears. I'll see if I can talk to that more when we look at a simple spur gear. The face width, though, is unique to bevel gears. So with spur gears and helical gears, they work on a principle of coincident cylinders, where the module of a tooth intrudes into the opposing cylinder. With bevel gear sets, they're coincident cones. And I make them a set because if you visualize this cone, you can see that as one gets bigger, might be easier with this one, as it gets bigger, let's make this bottom one large. As this one gets smaller or larger, you can see that the lower one, the other one gets shallower. You know, the smaller images, the smaller gear has a more shallow pitch angle of this cone relative to the pitch angle of the other cone, the larger toothed cone. So I'm going to change these to so that they're the same. When they're both the same, they're commonly called miter gears. But anyway, so the face width you can increase. This is limited to a third of the distance to the apex of this cone. And a new feature here is this messages output. I wanted to show you this. If you look at the tools and you're looking at the geometry nodes that you've got, it tells you that you've got an informational message. It's actually a warning, face width constrained to whatever. And that's because at some point in time, we just limit this to that size. So you can fix that by setting it somewhere underneath that value. Okay. Shaft angle is all about this angle right here. And that can be modified. It can actually be tweaked more than this, but I mean, I support different varying shaft angles. One problem is that it's really easy to break the gear set by changing the shaft angle by way too much. So the hole radius is obvious, but we will get messages if you try to create a hole bigger than the gear itself. So keep that in mind. It's limited there. Extra details is all about flank resolution, which you normally don't change. That has to do with the resolution of this involute curve along here. And I'll show you that actually in the spur gear. And the collar depth is all about the depth of this collar. You can increase that, make them nice and bulky, whatever you'd like to do. And the face resolution is the resolution along this face of the bevel gear. You don't need that too much. It's there mostly for me and future use, as in I might make spiral bevels, helical bevels, that sort of thing. All right. Let's look at a spur gear. I promise to not dwell too much on all this stuff. But one thing I wanted to do is I'll engage 2 spur gears. But I did want to just real quick look at the wireframe of this. Because one thing I've done with this release that's different than the older release, I know I added the bevel gear set, but for all the gears, you have this nice flow around the whole gear set, which means you can do edge loop selection if you were to apply this modifier and edit it in the using just plain old Blender, just editing it. You can use a bevel modifier, and I've exposed this Z faces, so you can change the number of faces along the side, and that can help you if you wanted to try to subsurf these. Anyway, that's available to you. So that's it really for the new topology changes. They're pretty tight, and I'm pretty pleased with them. So I'm going to engage 2 gears, and what we'll do is we'll engage. We'll keep that engagement going for the other 2, for helical and herringbone gears. So attach this other gear, and of course it's just sitting right on top of this gear. We'll transform that, and all we have to do is we have to move it in some direction. And I've exposed the reference pitch radius, which is where the actual contact is made. And actually, these, as they sit, won't mesh properly, but I'm going to throw them together because it's easy for me to show you what happens and exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about pitch radius. We're going to combine this along the x-axis. You could do it on x or y. So you can see how it's slammed together. And if you look at the wireframe, zoom in on this, you can see where they both just land on this, what's called a dedendum for both gears. And if you were to take this guy out and just look at this, so these are 3mm gears, both of them. And if you're meshing two gears, they always have to be the same module. So you have to be at least familiar with that concept. Okay, so looking at this with the grid, these are millimeter spaces, 1, 2, 3 to right here, 1, 2, 3 to this bottom of what's called the dedendum. From this point to here is the dedendum. From this point to here is the addendum, and this is the root. This is the clearance, which forms the root. And of course, you have this topology that flows around here for you. And when you're meshing two gears, and let's fix this real quick, because what we have is that's the whole point of this half pitch rotation. This is half a tooth, and you have to do that to one or the other when they don't mesh quite like that. And you can see how these connect just above the pitch. If you can just, it's right here, and this angle through here is the actual pressure angle. Oh, by the way, I wanted to show you pressure angle while we're here. Let's just look at one gear real quick. This pressure angle has to do with the shape of this gear, actually the shape of the flank, and it may adjust this base. If you look at this, right? More pointy gears, higher pressure angle. Stockier gears with a lower pressure angle. The default 20 is kind of the sweet spot, and you probably aren't going to change that off that unless you have a special case. So let's get this going. So that's really spur gears. If you've used the toolkit before, you've played with that. Let's make some space here. What I'm going to do is just move these gears. I've already shown you gear ratios. I'm not going to show them to you again. I just want to show off the gears. And with helical gears, the helix angle that you see has to do with that angle. Okay, and this has to do with this angle through here, up and down and across. That's the gear angle. It's not how the base is moved this way. It's how these have moved this way. And the curious thing about helical gears is two opposing gears, the ones you mesh with, for them to mesh properly, they have to have a twist that's opposite from the other one, and it's possible that they'll need this half pitch rotation. Okay. And that's really the only difference between this and spur gears. In fact, if you were to look into the guts of a spur gear, it's simply a helical gear with zero angle. Okay. Didn't mean to delete that. Sorry. Okay. So let's look at the helix gear, or the herringbone gear rather. Herringbone gear is actually no different than a helical gear. They're just stacked helicals with opposing angles. And the same thing applies. You may need a half hitch rotation and a left twist. And once they're in place, check both sides. They're perfectly aligned. Okay. Unique to the herringbone gear is the gap, is that space in between. You can even set this to 0 to slam them together. And if you have wondered about the helical gear as it's meshing and turning has a certain amount of torque pushing up, vertically in the Z direction, for example, in this type of rotation. The herringbone gear has an advantage that as these are rotating, you have the torque, an opposite torque on the bottom, pushing the other way. And so these can sit and not, basically there's a pressure that's pushed away from the center or towards the center, depending on how you're rotating, and they stay engaged. It's just kind of an interesting gear. All right, that's pretty much it for the basic overview. I'm going to bring in a spur gear and a gear rack and show you this real quick. Okay, so we've already seen the spur gear, the gear rack. Gear rack sits here with the pitch. The gear rack has a pitch as well, and it also has a pressure angle, thinner or fatter gears, just like a regular gear. Modules should match, and basically you can change the number of teeth depending on what you need, and you can shift them off center with a half pitch shift to help you. It's just a convenience, so you don't have to calculate half a tooth to move it to engage a gear. Also, it is possible to have helical gears either way, okay? And these are both lining up right along the x-axis. I try to make this simple to mess with regards to meshing, just being able to move along one axis, trying to do the right thing. So you will want to check this translation along the x-axis. I can already tell that it's going to need a half pitch shift, and that amount is going to be the pitch radius, reference pitch radius of this gear. So all you have to do in this case is, here, let's do this. Take a vector, combine with this pitch radius into x. There you go. And perfectly meshed. Now, animating this will be fun, but that's your basic overview. I mean, I could show you the bevel shaft, but I think that's typical stuff. Goes in here. The length, you can increase. It's got a nice topology so that if you wanted to make this deeper, so yeah, it's just a cylinder. You can change the resolution to make it rounder. I typically set it to something like 2 with a much smaller width. So it's just got that nice edge to it. And it can look really nice when you're smoothing it. Okay? And that's it. Okay, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the asset library. Thanks.